people that you came in as. You'd be changed. Had been not being changed, having missed an opportunity because we're not give up. Let's allow him to lead us. Let's tune in and listen to his voice and not miss another opportunity. Amen. I know that throughout the week, a lot of times we can go through things when we can have a hard week, and we can bring that in, and our flesh can begin to dictate how we respond and interact with him at Shabbat. Whenever Yahweh attempts to speak to you, it's going to be filtered through your flesh. That means if you haven't dealt with this flesh, what are you going to get out of this? Probably not a lot, because it's going to be filtered through this. I want you to do me a favor, and I want you to raise your right hand and bring it right here. And repeat after me, flesh. And if you got to choke it, choke it. Flesh, you're going to listen to the word of Yahweh. Amen? How many of you really mean that? Well, guess what? This next week is going to tell. Amen. Let's get started. We're going to look at this week's Torah portion. It's titled Vayishlach. Can you say that with me? Vayishlach. It's translated as meaning, and he sent. And it comes from Genesis chapter 32, verse 3 through chapter 36, verse 43. And I'm going to be quite honest with you, this was a very difficult portion. How many of you read it? There's a lot of things in it that really don't make sense, isn't it? It seems that a lot of things are upside down. Things go backwards. Things are opposite of what they should be. It's a portion that's recording the return of Jacob. He's coming home. He's leaving Laban's house. He's coming back to the promised land. How many of you realize we're on that same journey? You're heading home. This becomes a pattern for you. There's some things that happen in this Torah portion that need to be changed on this next trip home. There's some things that happened where there was a reversal of roles. And we find that as we get ready to come back, once again, you're going to have to face Esau just like Jacob did. But this time the encounter needs to be different. When we look at this portion, we find that it's full of paradoxes. From the time in the womb, Jacob's been told that he'll be the head, that Esau, his brother, will bow to him, that Jacob will have the right of the firstborn. Yet what do we see happening in this Torah portion? Who bows to who? We find that Jacob bows to Esau. Well, Yahweh's not a man that he should lie, and yet we never once see Esau bowing to Jacob. That's a problem, isn't it? And unless we know how to deal with this, then it kind of puts our paradigm, we've got a problem. We don't really know how to correct this. We don't know how to explain this. We find that not only does Jacob bow to Esau, but his whole household, except for Benjamin, who's not yet born, bows to Esau. And so when we begin to read this portion, it seems as if the promises of Yahweh that have been declared over Jacob, that they're not being fulfilled right now. In fact, it's the direct opposite. How many of you are at a point in your life where it seems as if the promises of Yahweh have been cut off? You've been given a sent word, you've been given a promise, but it seems as if the direct opposite's happening in your life. Well, then we could very well learn from the life of Jacob, couldn't we? Because there's some things that are happening here that's going to give you insight into how to fix this and how to change this. We find also in this Torah portion that Jacob gets a name change. Isn't that interesting? Because if we go back, we know that his grandfather and grandmother as well had a name change, Abraham and Sarah. But Jacob's name change is a little different, isn't it? We find that Jacob's name is changed, and the declaration is made that no longer are you going to be called Jacob, but now Israel. Yet how many times is he referred to as Israel in the Torah portion? He's constantly, again and again, referred to as Jacob. Once again, it seems as if we're in a conundrum. We've got a problem. What's going on here? You realize that Abraham and Sarah were never again referred to as their previous name, but Jacob's hardly referred to as his new name, Israel. Not only does he have a name change, but we find that when we read the portion, there's actually two different occasions when his name is changed. That's quite interesting because we know nothing is by accident. Yahweh didn't forget that he had already appeared and did it. There's a significance here. The one that most of us think about is when he wrestles with the angel, with the Messiah. and he's touched in the hip and he walks with a limp. That's what we think of when we think of the name change from Jacob to Israel. But guess what? In this same portion, Yahweh shows up again, and we find that there's also a name change. Once again, the same statement's being made. So we have to ask a question, what's all this about? It seems as if this portion has got a lot of things happening in it that from the surface, it really doesn't make sense, and we don't have an answer for it. And yet we find that if we'll dig into the Hebrew language, not only can we find the answers to these questions, but we can also get some insight into why the house is where we are today. Do you realize the promises of Yahweh aren't having the full effect that they could be? We're not walking in the level of blessings that we could be. We're not walking in the level of power that we could be. We're not seeing the miracles that we could be. And the answers can be found in this Torah portion. Do you realize that we have a tendency to repeat things? We're always in this cycle. Adam and Eve, you'll find it's the same thing being repeated right here with Jacob. Later, his descendants in Egypt, it's the same thing. It's a cycle. The generation today, we're still in this cycle. We continue to repeat the mistakes of our forefathers, and yet we're being reminded that there's a generation that's going to be raised up in the end that's going to break that cycle, amen? That's going to raise up, and that's going to be Israel, that's going to prevail and walk in the power. Now let's look at this name of the portion. It's Vayishlach, and it's translated as "and he sent." But we're going to look at this word before we ever go any further in the portion. We're going to break down this word, and we're going to see what's going on here. Jacob's going home. There's a battle that he's about to be faced with, and we know that this is a shadow picture for you and I, right? We understand that this deals with where we're at. Well, let's look and try to lay a foundation for what this journey is about. This phrase, Vayishlach, it has a numerical value of 354. We know that every single Hebrew letter has a corresponding numerical value. The numbers are important. 354 is the same value as another word in Hebrew. It's Strong's number 1880, and it's the word deshin. I'm going to say the meaning of this word very carefully because I don't want to get in trouble. It's translated as meaning fat ashes. Don't mistake what I said. It was the ashes from the burnt offerings, and it was the fat ashes that had to be carried outside of the camp. In fact, in Leviticus 6:11, we read of this, and it says, "And he shall put off his garments," talking about the priest, "and he'll put on other garments, and he'll carry forth the ashes, the deshin, without the camp unto a clean place." The root of this word can mean abundance, fertility, to anoint. It's dealing with prosperity, blessings. But let's look at this, because somehow this idea of the ashes being carried outside the camp, this journey, is somehow connected with the journey of Jacob coming home. So we need to look at this. What does it mean, this burnt offering, these ashes being removed? Because we're beginning to see a parallel here. Well, let's break down this word, deshin. And maybe it's going to give us some insight into what this whole journey of Jacob coming home is about. It's spelled with the dalet shin nun. The dalet represents the door. We know that in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, Yeshua makes the statement, "I'm the door." He's the access. He allows you to have contact with Yahweh. He's the Vav. He's the one that connects us, the doorway. It's connected to the shin nun. The shin nun is a root which can mean to change, to learn. It deals with the purification process. How many of you realize that when you come in contact with the Messiah, with the door, you're going to be changed? No one ever came in contact with him and didn't walk away changed. Now, they may have changed for the worse because they hardened their heart, but nonetheless, there was a difference. There was a change. They walked away differently. We find then that as we look at this journey of the ashes, it's the picture that's being painted of one getting access, one being presented with a doorway. They're coming in contact with the one that has the ability to change them, to purify them, to teach them in order for them to learn. And it seems that this is also the purpose of the journey of Jacob. He's coming in contact with one that has the ability to change him, to purify him, to teach his household. He's being given access. But the interesting thing is that this root, this shin nun, which can mean to change, to learn, to purify, it can also infer destruction. In other words, it seems to be pointing and reminding us that how we handle the door, how we approach the door, how we handle the Messiah, how we choose to respond to him when he shows up and he begins to speak to us, it then determines whether we've opened a door to destruction in our life or whether we're being purified, changed for the better. Do you realize there's consequences for how we handle him? We're not allowed to handle him just any way we like. Well, let's look at this a little bit further. We find that these ashes were from the burnt offering. The burnt offering was the Olah offering. It was a whole burnt offering. The interesting thing is that when you look at that word Olah, once again, it carries that same idea. There's a door, something's being revealed. You're being given access to something that you've been denied to in the past. The Olah offering is spelled with the ayin, lamed, and the hay. The ayin means to reveal something, to give you access for you to perceive it. And it's connected to that lamed, hay, and it means to her. It's qualifying it. He's revealing it to her, to the bride. She's being given access. Well, that's the same thing that's happening today. Do you realize that? Yahweh's giving you access. It's a divine appointment. You're being given an opportunity. He's revealing himself to you. And we find that however we respond to him, however we treat and handle him as he reveals himself, it then determines the outcome. It then determines whether we're purified, whether we're changed, or whether we open a door for destruction. Nadab and Abihu learned that the hard way, didn't they? You don't get to handle him any way you want. You will open a door to destruction in your own life. The interesting thing is this word Olah, it's the same letters that form the word Aleh. It's translated as meaning a leaf. It's first used in Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, and it describes the fig leaves that Adam and Eve clothed themselves with after the fall. Those fig leaves, the Aleh, it represented a false covering. It wasn't sufficient. They needed the blood of the lamb. It represented their own attempts, the carnal flesh, to cover itself. And we find this is connected to the burnt offering. In other words, it's this individual. It's the flesh. It's the carnal man that has to be burnt up. And we find that this was the purpose of the journey. It's about a change. This is the one that's being changed. This is the one that's being purified. This is the one that's being offered up. Earlier during the praise and worship, you sang the song, "Change My Heart, Oh Yah." You're the potter, I'm the clay. But how many of us really mean it when we say those words? You realize it's a painful process. It's burning it up. It's stripping away all of these things that we hold on to, and yet this is what we're being told to offer. If you break down this verse here where it says that when he carries these ashes outside the camp, he has to change his garments. Well, let's look at some of these words in the Hebrew and see what's taking place here on this journey, because remember, it's connected now to the journey of Jacob. Jacob's going home. You're the descendants of Jacob. You're going home. It's the same journey. We're told in Leviticus 6:11 that he has to put off his garments and put on other garments. The word put off here is pashat in Hebrew. It means to strip off, to strip oneself of. But it's interesting because the two-letter root is the pei shin. It forms Strong's number 6580, pash, and it means wickedness, rebellion, a transgression. The word garments here that are being removed is the word beged. And it can mean garment or clothing, but it can also mean deceit, treachery. And then finally, he's told to put on other garments. The word other is acher. It's Strong's number 312, and it can mean other, another, different. But it can also take on the meaning that, and it's indicating that a person has become another person. Literally, he has another heart. In other words, he's changed. He's become a new creation, a new creature. And so we find here that this is what's being connected with the journey of Jacob. Jacob's been gone a long time. He's been in the house of Laban. And we find that his journey home is reminding us of the same journey when the ashes are carried outside of the camp, because it's a picture of the individual being changed. It's about the garments of rebellion, treachery, deceit, wickedness, all of that being removed and you becoming a new person with a new heart. Change my heart, O Yah, allowing the carnal man to die and the righteous man to flourish. And we find that this is the purpose of the journey of Jacob. Jacob, the carnal man, has to die. He has to be offered up. He has to be burnt up. He has to be purified. And yet we remember that word can also mean to open a door to destruction. Do you realize that to fail to deal with the carnal man, yet still attempt to handle the door, still attempt to gain access, in other words, to ride the fence, to keep both, not deal with the flesh, but still try to gain access to the door, that's what's pointing to how we open a door to destruction in our lives instead. So could it be then that this was the purpose of Jacob's journey? To become a new creature, to be changed, to be purified, to allow the dross to be burnt up in order to bring forth the gold. And we find that that's the same journey that you and I are on. The dross is being burned up so the gold can be brought forth. That should be exciting. Feel free to shout anytime. Now let's look at the root of this word, Vayishlach, because this is the journey. This is the name of this portion. It comes from this word, sent. Well, the root of it is a word that some of you, if you've listened to the teachings, you're probably familiar with it. You've probably heard this word before. It's the word shalach. It's Strong's number 7971, and it means to send away, to let go, to stretch out, to be set free. But it can also mean to be put away, to be divorced. It's interesting because the first time it's used is in Genesis in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are shalach. They're sent out. They're divorced from the Garden of Eden after they partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Do you realize it's the same picture that's being presented? They didn't deal with the carnal man, and yet they still attempted to have access to the door, and it opened a door to destruction in their own lives. And they're shalach. They're sent out. They're sent away from it. They lose access. This word shalach, it contains the two-letter root of the shin lamed. This root means a sin or an error, but it's not just any little sin, a transgression, but it's a great sin, one that's deserving of death. In fact, it's only used in the context of one that would mishandle the Ark of the Covenant. In other words, mishandling the presence of Yahweh. Remember the story of Uzzah. He reaches out to steady the ark and he's struck down graveyard dead. He mishandled Yahweh, just like Nadab and Abihu, just like Adam and Eve, mishandling the presence of Yahweh. And yet this is what the root is of this word, this journey that Jacob's going on. And so it begins to shift our paradigm a little, doesn't it? This journey is about Jacob has to change. And the reason is, in the past, his house has been guilty of mishandling Yahweh. How many of us have also been guilty of mishandling the presence of Yahweh? How many times do we come into his presence with the carnal man? We haven't offered him up. We haven't burnt it up. We've let him rule and reign. He's the dictator. And yet we come in and we attempt to access the door, and we wonder why things don't go the way we think they should. We wonder why it seems as if there's destruction running rampant. And we're being reminded, you've got to offer this up. This has to be purified. You cannot mishandle him. Let's look a little bit further. It's interesting because we ask the question, how? How have we mishandled you? How have we done you wrong? How have we reached out to try to instead? We thought it was right. We thought we were in the right. And yet, here we are. We find that we've done something wrong. Well, let's look at this a little bit further. It's interesting because this word shalach, it's spelled with the shin, the lamed, and the ket. These same letters rearranged form the word lakash. The first time I saw it, instantly it reminded me of the word nakash. It's the same root, the serpent. And in fact, this word lakash has a very similar meaning. It means to whisper, incantation, magic. The serpent was the whisperer. He's the one that whispered. He hissed. He was an incantation. He was a magician, one that practiced the dark arts. This word can also mean a serpent charmer. So it's not talking about the serpent himself, but it's talking about an individual that would attempt to charm the serpent. One that would attempt to handle the serpent. One that would attempt to whisper, to use the nakash, the serpent. Now remember, this is connected with the house of Jacob. Jacob going on a journey. Jacob being reminded that on this journey, you're going to have to change. There's some things that got to be dealt with in the house. Before you get back in the land, there's some things that need to be dealt with. Could it be inferring then that as we look at this word, the name of this portion, that Jacob's house has mishandled Yahweh? Because instead of allowing the carnal man, the fleshly man, to be offered up, to be changed, to go through the purifying process, they've been busy attempting to charm the serpent. They've been busy attempting to handle him, to listen to his whispering. Doesn't that sound like Eve in the garden? Tuning her ear to the Nakash, listening to his whispering, attempting to charm the serpent. And because of this, we find that Jacob's house remains in the fig leaf covering. They remain in something that's insufficient. It's not burnt up. And because of this, we find that now, because they've attempted to charm the serpent, they've mishandled Yahweh, this one hasn't been dealt with. We find that now a door to destruction has been opened up for the house of Jacob. Now we understand there's consequences. Remember Adam and Eve, there were consequences. There's shalach. They're sent out. They're sent away. They lose access. Let me ask you a question. How many times have we been guilty of the same thing? How many times do we miss an opportunity to hear the voice of Yahweh because we're too busy attempting to charm the serpent? Because we're too busy and we didn't take the time to deal with the flesh. And so we miss it. We can't come into his presence because we've got the wrong clothing on. We've got the wrong garment. We haven't offered up the Olah offering. We haven't allowed it to be burnt up. This begins to shift our paradigm then, doesn't it? It seems as if when we read it in the English, poor Jacob, he's had to deal with Laban, he's had to go through all of this, and now when he goes back, Esau's coming. And we look at the encounter with Esau as the main focus point of this Torah portion. That's where all of our attention goes to, this encounter between Jacob and Esau. And yet it seems as if before he ever encounters Esau, before he ever meets up with him, the Hebrew language is already letting us know Jacob's house has been compromised. Jacob's house has been involved with some things they had no business being involved in. They've mishandled Yahweh. And we find that there's consequences when that happens. A door to destruction opens up in our lives because we let the enemy in the camp. Do you realize he can't do anything? He can't plunder your house unless you let him in. If the doors are closed, he has no legal access in there. But when we open the door, when we call him in and we attempt to handle him, and we attempt to pet him, to charm him, the door's opened. And now he has every right to be there. So it begins to make us look at this encounter with Esau a little differently, doesn't it? The door was already open before Esau ever came. The battle between Jacob and Esau is not the main focal point here. That's the consequences. That's the door to destruction that was opened before he ever came in contact with them. In fact, in Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 17, this word lakash, the one that would be a serpent charmer, we find this word, it's only used a few times in the scriptures, and one of those is here. And it's a prophecy from Yahweh about the consequences when Israel wouldn't do as they were told. It says, "For behold, I will send," same word, shalach, "I will send serpents, cockatrices among you, which will not be charmed. They won't be lakash, and they will bite you, says Yahweh." In other words, because you wanted to handle it, because you invited it in, I'm going to send it as a judgment upon you anyway. And this one, you're not going to be able to handle. You're not going to be able to charm it. It's going to bite you. There's going to be a consequence. As you let him in the house, you open the door, and now you're going to have to deal with him. Is it possible then that this encounter with Esau was the consequences? It's not the battle, it's not the end all, but it was the effects, because Jacob had already opened the door. They had attempted to charm the serpent. In other words, because of previous action, something that happens before he comes in contact with Esau, now Yahweh sends the one that's going to bite him. He sends the one that won't be charmed. In fact, we see this taking place in Genesis chapter 33, verse 4. In the encounter with Jacob and Esau, in the English, it says that Esau ran to meet him, and he embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And if we have no idea what's going on and we have no understanding of the Hebrew, we think, oh, wow, it's a brotherly reunion. That's good. Bless his darling heart. They finally reunited. They've kissed and they've made up, and now Jacob can come home and all is forgiven, and the house is Akkad again. They're all one. And yet that's not at all what's taking place. In the Hebrew, there in Genesis 33:4, the word for kissed, it's the phrase in Hebrew is Vayishkehu. And if you look at it in the Hebrew, there's a dot above every single letter. The rabbis teach those dots above every single letter above that phrase, it's representing the bite marks, the teeth marks. Esau was biting Jacob, attempting to kill Jacob, eradicate Jacob. It's Jeremiah 8:17. The serpent seed, he sends the one that won't be charmed to bite you because you've opened the door in the house. It's interesting too, because if you look at the word for kiss here in Hebrew, it's neshak. It's a play on words though, because the word for bite there in Jeremiah is also neshak. One spelled with the kuf, the other with the kaf, but the same roots there. It's the play on words. He comes to bite you. Jeremiah 8:17. The door was open. This is the consequences. Well, this changes things, doesn't it? This is a little bit differently than we looked at before. So often we look at Jacob and Esau. That's where all the focus is, this battle between Jacob and Esau. But now we can understand that maybe this was just the consequence. This was the goal. This was the end of it. This was the result due to something that was going on previously. Well, I don't know about you, but it would behoove us, then it would be in our best interest, wouldn't it, to understand what was going on before then. If the consequences was having to deal with Esau and him coming, then what did we do to have to engage him? What did we do that led him in the house? You realize so often, a lot of us, the only time we realize that the enemy's in the house is when he begins to wage war, is when we find ourselves in a pitched battle. And then we realize, oh my goodness, the enemy's in the house. He's in the camp. He got here, and now we have to deal with it. And we have no idea how he got here, and we're so focused on trying to deal with him that we never realize, where in the world did the door get opened? How did he get in here? Yeshua spends a lot of time talking about how you can't plunder the house. You can't come in unless you bind the strong man. Do you realize that there's a legality here, and the enemy knows that? He can't come in if he doesn't have an access point. You got to open the door. You've got to let him in. You've got to attempt to charm the serpent. The battle begins long before we ever realize most of the time. And we find that then it's too late. Now we're having to face the consequences, because there's consequences when we play with the serpent, isn't there? Adam and Eve learned it the hard way. Genesis 33 verse 3, let's look at this encounter with Esau, because now we understand, obviously, there's something else that's going on here. Let's look at this a little bit further. If this is the consequences, let's look at what these consequences were. And maybe it'll give us some insight into how in the world he got in the house in the first place. Maybe it'll give us some insight into what allowed this to take place. Because when Esau encounters Jacob this time, remember, Jacob is the one that bows. The roles become reversed. We find that Esau's the one that prevails. So we understand it's not just a friendly brothers reunion, but there's some very significant things that take place. Jacob bows to Esau, not just once, not just twice, but 7 times. Why? Esau receives a gift from Jacob. What's the significance of that gift? Well, let's look. In Genesis 33, verse 3, we read about this encounter. It says, and he passed over before them, and he bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. And Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And it goes on to say in verse 6, it says, then the handmaidens came near, they and their children, and they bowed themselves. And Leah also with her children came near and bowed themselves. And after came Joseph near and Rachel, and they bowed themselves. The entire house bows before Esau. In verse 10, we read of the gift. It says, and Jacob said, nay, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. For therefore I have seen thy face as though I had seen the face of Elohim, and thou wast pleased with me. Well, let's look at this a little bit further. Because in our Western mindset, oh, the brothers are being reunited. But there's something else quite differently that's happening in the Hebrew. Let's look at this word for bowed. Jacob bows 7 times. In the Hebrew, it's Strong's number 7812. It's shakah, and it means to bow down, to do homage, to submit oneself. The interesting thing is this same word's used in Psalms chapter 81, verse 9, and it's used in reference to how they would bow and worship pagan gods, how they would bow and worship a strange god, an idol. It says, there shall no strange god be in thee, neither shalt thou worship, neither shalt thou shakah to any strange god. And I want you to remember that because that's part of the clue. If you begin to look at this, remember this is in ancient Israel. They understood covenant cutting practices. They knew the whole way to cut a covenant. We've lost that. So a lot of this we see and we don't really understand what's taking place. But the act of bowing down in antiquity was a common act of submission of an inferior before a superior. Now, wait a minute. Jacob's doing this to Esau. It's quite different from the prophecy, isn't it? Esau's supposed to bow to Jacob, and yet the roles are reversed. Jacob bows to Esau. But not only once, but 7 times. Bowing 7 times was a demonstration of reverence that was the customary act of homage a vassal would offer to his overlord, to the suzerain. Who's supposed to be the suzerain? Yahweh's supposed to be our suzerain, the great king. We're the vassal. And yet we find that Jacob comes before Esau and presents himself as a vassal. He greets Esau as his suzerain, as his king. We find that Jacob greets his brother as a vassal greeted the suzerain king with an act of reverence that had its origin in the royal court. In fact, when you begin to study how it took place in Egypt, the vassals would show their submission to Pharaoh by bowing 7 times at the feet of the king. Isn't it interesting? Because remember, it's a cycle. His descendants do the exact same thing, don't they? They come before Pharaoh. They sell themselves as vassals, and they become the servants of Pharaoh, honoring him just as Jacob did it before to Esau. Bowing 7 times was an act that acknowledged him not only to be Lord and King, but also God. So we can see there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. And as a side note, I thought it was really interesting because bowing 7 times is how you would acknowledge one not as only as Lord or King, but also as God. Isn't it interesting that the Sabbath is a sign of the covenant, the 7th day? Could it be that when we keep the Shabbat, when you keep the Sabbath, it's as if you've bowed 7 times before the King? And not only do you acknowledge him as King and Lord, but you acknowledge him as your Elohim, as your God as well. It would seem that the Sabbath is quite important, isn't it? It's bowing, it's acknowledging who your King is, who you worship as God. That means when we don't do it or we choose to do something else, whatever we do instead, that's acknowledging that's who we look to. That's our source. That's our King. That's who is number one, our top priority. Let's look at the word for gift here. We find that Jacob bows to Esau 7 times. He presents himself as a vassal. He looks to Esau as the suzerain. And all this, remember, it's a consequence of something that happened before. Let's look at the word for gift. He brings a gift to Esau. In Strong's number 4503, minka. How many of you recognize that word? It's one of the offerings that was brought in the tabernacle to Yahweh. Yahweh required a minka, a grain offering. It means gift, but it can also mean tribute, an offering, a sacrifice, a meat offering, a tribute that was exacted from a tributary people under the milder name of a gift. In other words, when Jacob bows before Esau and he presents this gift, this minka, this tribute, there's a reversal of roles that just took place. Jacob had the birthright. Jacob was the firstborn. Jacob had the inheritance. But when he bows and brings this to Esau, he submits himself and his house, his descendants, as a tribute to Esau. Esau takes it back. It's a covenant cutting process. 7 times he's covenanted himself to this. It's no accident that Esau shows up and he brings how many men? He brings 400 men. What a coincidence. 400 is the value of the Hebrew letter tav. The tav represents covenant. It's a covenant that's being cut, a reversal of roles. But that letter tav, not only does it mean covenant, it can mean to seal something, as in to seal the covenant. And if you study ancient covenant cutting processes, you don't seal the covenant at the beginning. That's not how you start it. To seal the covenant happens at the end. In other words, when Esau shows up with 400 men to seal the covenant, it started before this. This is the conclusion. This is the end of it. That means we got to go back. How in the world did we get to this point? How many of you have ever been in the midst of something and you realize, you look around, you're in bondage, you're in slavery, you've sold yourself, and you wonder, how in the world did I get here? What did I do? It's as if we black out and we have no idea what happened, and here we are. We're in a covenant. We've charmed the serpent. He's in the house. We're in bondage and we're stuck, and we have no idea how we got there in the first place. Now let's keep looking. We find that this event where Jacob bows to Esau and presents this minkah, this gift, this is what has defined the relationship between these two houses, hasn't it? Esau's been the head. Esau has controlled the inheritance. Esau's been the one that's prevailed, and Israel has been the one that's been under his foot. And yet we find that Yahweh's not a man that he should lie, is he? We're told that Esau's going to be the one that's going to bow. It's Jacob's inheritance. Jacob has he loved. Jacob's the one that's been chosen. And so we find then that something's got to change. And it's interesting because throughout history, we see this repeating itself, don't we? Remember, his descendants do the same thing to Pharaoh. They submit themselves as vassals to Pharaoh. They take Pharaoh as their god. That's why the judgments had to fall upon all the gods of Egypt, because Israel was worshiping them as well. Well, let's look at this a little bit further. We find that this is a question that's troubled many. Why does Jacob do this? Why does Jacob allow the roles to be reversed, to be changed? He was given the promise. He had the inheritance. It was rightfully, legally his. What happens for this to take place? Well, we understand that we're given that clue from Jeremiah. It seems as if that's the case, that this is a consequence. It's a judgment that's sent by Yahweh and allowed to happen due to some previous events that took place, due to something that happened before this encounter with Esau. So we have to ask the question, how did the enemy get in the house in the first place? Our clue once again comes from that word deshin. Remember the ashes that had to be taken outside the camp. It can infer to prosper, to be anointed, but it's interesting because this word deshin can also be used, and it was used in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 20, to refer to Israel when they would be in the promised land, but they would grow fat. They would be deshin on the pagan culture and worshiping other gods. They would become fertile. They would become blessed by these relationships with these other gods. And so it seems as if maybe if we backtrack, perhaps that this encounter with Esau has to do with the house taking other gods. Maybe it has to do with the fact that the house has already given the open door because they took something else. They already recognized someone else as their suzerain. They already chose to worship another. And so when Esau shows up, it's sealing the contract. We find that directly before this journey takes place, in Genesis 31, before he goes to meet Esau, guess what happens? It's in last week's Torah portion. Rachel steals Laban's house gods in preparation for this journey. Do you think that might be an indicator when he got in the house? It's just a tree. It's just a holiday. It's just something that I like to. He knows my heart. And yet we find that constantly we bring these other gods into the house, and we're being reminded there's a consequence. You may not see it right now. Rachel may not have realized what was going to happen, but guess what? Not only her house, but her children are sold into bondage because she let him in the house. She attempted to charm the serpent. She mishandled Yahweh. Adam and Eve, it's just a tree. It's just a piece of fruit. It can't be all that bad. It sounds really good. It looks really good, but there's consequences, isn't there? It seems that this is when Jacob's house attempts to charm the snake. Just like Eve, Rachel allows access to the serpent by stealing the idols of Laban. And just like Adam and Eve, Jacob's house must now face the consequences of the sin. Everything that follows in the encounter with Esau, it's only acting out in the physical what had already been done in the spiritual. The door was open. These were the consequences. We find that we can never be successful. We can never overpower Esau in the physical if we're not willing to deal with the things in the spiritual of how we got into the house in the first place. Let's look at this word for images. We're told that Rachel stole the images of Laban. The word images is Strong's number 8655, teraphim. And it means idols, images. But it has the three-letter root, tav, resh, pei. In fact, the Yod Memo means the plural, teraphim, but the root is teraph. Well, it's interesting because according to Klein's etymological dictionary of the Hebrew language, that root, tav, resh, pei, can mean and be translated as the essential part of a document. The part of the document which makes it binding, inasmuch as it has to be filled in with the date, the amount of the debt, and the signature of the witnesses. Isn't that interesting? The whole scenario with Esau was a covenant-cutting process. Bowing, acknowledging Esau as the suzerain, sealing the covenant, the 400 men that come with him. It's the end of the deal, and yet we find that the beginning was when Rachel stole the teraphim. When Rachel took the idols and brought them into the house. We find that when Rachel took the teraphim, the root of that word literally means to sign and seal the document. She signed the document, the covenant contract, the debts incurred. Now we can understand why Jacob goes through this with Esau. He understood the door's already been opened in the house. The covenant's already been signed. The witnesses have been seen. The debt's been incurred. The amount owed is already there. And we find that he goes through this covenant ritual with Esau, allowing himself to be put into bondage because the document was already signed. It was a done deal. Esau showed up to seal the contract. Isn't that interesting? Now we can understand a lot of us, we may be in a situation and we don't know how we got there, and we can't properly fight the enemy, can we, until we go back and figure out how he first got into the house in the first place. If we don't know how he first got there, then we're never ever going to be successful. We'll stay in bondage until we learn what doors got to be closed, what things have got to go. We've got to be willing to burn it up, to let it go, to understand we've mishandled him in the past, but it's time to learn. We're being given an opportunity. Remember the dalet, it means a doorway, access. You can have access again. You can have a doorway that's open to you. You can once again handle Yahweh if you're willing to close those other doors, to deal with the areas that we've messed up in the past. In Psalm chapter 81, verse 11, after the verse where he says, don't bow before the other gods, after they're warned not to worship, not to shakah before them, a couple of verses later, it says, but my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. Hasn't that been the story of this household? He tells you, don't do that. Don't touch it. And what do? I got to touch it. I got to know. I got to open the door. I got to talk to him. I've got to see what it's all about. Let's look at that phrase that it says, Israel would have none of me. They would none of me. In the Hebrew, it's Strong's number 14, abah, and it means to be willing, to consent, to be positively inclined to respond to some authority or petition, to consent to an authority. You realize that's what it's all about? Whose authority will we respond to? Who are we willing to consent to? Yahweh tells us, honor me, worship me this way. Don't bow before those others. Keep those doors closed. Don't bring that in your house. I'm the suzerain. I'm the king. And we find that if we're willing to consent to his authority, then we can be in his camp. And yet if we're willing to consent to the authority of another, we open the door to destruction in our own lives. It's interesting because the value of this word is 8. It has a numerical value or gematria of 8. Well, it just so happens this is the 8th Torah portion. So it seems that's what this is all about, this whole struggle with Jacob and Esau, Jacob coming home. It's all about testing to see exactly whose authority will Jacob respond to, exactly who's God in the house of Jacob. Who is he willing to bow before? It's interesting because 8 is the number of new beginnings. And yet 8 is also the value of the ket. It represents a fence, an enclosed place. We're being reminded you have the potential to access a new beginning. You can come out of that bondage. You can come out of that slavery that we've been in. You can have a new beginning. You can be changed. But there's some things that can keep us fenced off from that new beginning. There's some things that can keep us yoked in bondage. It's interesting because the ket is written with the Zion and the Vav. The Zion represents the crowned one, the king. The Vav represents the man. In other words, the vassal that's being linked to that king, being yoked together. We find that this Torah portion, it's reminding the house today, you've got an opportunity to come out of bondage. You can come home It's time to make the journey, but whether or not you get access to that new beginning, whether or not you're changed and refined, or whether you're fenced off from it, is going to be determined by whose authority we choose to consent to, who we choose to be yoked with, who we choose to acknowledge as king, whether it's the Messiah, Yahweh, the one that's giving us this chance, this access, or the counterfeit. Esau, Pharaoh, the idols. It takes many different faces, but it's the same thing all the way from the garden forward. The question becomes, then, are we willing to deal with our flesh to access the door, or would we rather spend the time charming the serpent? It's a lot easier to entertain the serpent, isn't it? You ain't got to change your clothes for him. You don't got to get prepared. He'll show up. He don't care. And yet we find with Yahweh, you're being told, you've got to bring the Olah. You've got to allow this one to be burnt up. You've got to be purified. You've got to be changed. You've got to walk the straight and narrow if you're going to acknowledge him as the king. It's easy to see then how the house is operated under this covenant with Esau, isn't it? It's easy to see how we've been content to serve another other than Yahweh. Throughout history, we see it. The Torah is full of story after story. Esau, Pharaoh, again and again, the house of Israel goes into bondage and they worship another. They're vassals to another king, and they allow that to happen. And yet we're being offered a chance at a new beginning. But how can the roles be righted again? How can Esau this time be the one that bows instead of Jacob? How can the house of Jacob today be freed from this bondage, from this covenant that was cut? Now we're going to look at the significance of the second name change of Jacob, because you'll find this is where the answers are revealed to those questions. Remember, we already said that in this Torah portion, Jacob's name is changed twice. The first time is the one that we're most familiar with, but it happens again. In Genesis 35, chapter 35, verse 9, after the encounter with Esau, we find that we're told that Yahweh appeared unto Jacob again when he came out of Padan Aram and blessed him. And Yahweh said unto him, thy name is Jacob. Thy name shall not be called any more Jacob, but Israel shall be thy name. And he called his name Israel. The interesting thing is that everything's the same in this verse in the Hebrew to the previous verse, except for one word, the word for called. And we're going to look at that in a moment. But we need to backtrack. What caused this to happen? What causes Yahweh to show up again and let him know your name's going to be Israel? He already knows that. He's already been told that. He was told that before he sold the birthright to Esau. And yet now we find Yahweh shows up again and says, your name's going to be Israel. There's something taking place here. We need to look at what's going on. Directly before he shows up, in Genesis 35, verse 1, we're told of some things that are happening in the house before the second name change. In verse 1, it says, and Elohim said unto Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make there an altar unto Yahweh that appeared unto thee when thou fleddest from the face of Esau thy brother. Then Jacob said unto his household and to all that were with him, put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments. And in verse 4 we read that they gave unto Jacob all the strange gods which were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem. It's interesting because Shechem represents the shoulders. It's where the two mountains were, Ebal and Gerizim, the mount of blessings and the mount of curses. It represented where the blessings and the curses were spoken forth. It represented the shoulders that would bear the weight of the Torah. In other words, Jacob's house has to make a decision. If we're going to be Israel, if we're going to be those that stand upright, we better be willing to shoulder the responsibilities of the Torah. We better be willing to change our garments. Isn't that what they do? It says, put away the strange gods that are among you and change your garments. Deal with that fleshly man. Bury the idols. Close the door and be willing to shoulder the responsibility of the Torah. We find that Jacob commands his house to put these idols away, and it's only after he does this. Now remember, they left Laban's house, and they've had these idols now for a while. They faced Esau. They've dwelt in Shechem. He's had all kinds of issues with his house, and now we find finally that Yahweh's telling them to go forth again, and we find that Jacob tells his house to finally close the door. Bury the idols. Change your garments. It seems to finish the connection here. Rachel stole the house gods, opens the door for the enemy in the house, causing them to mishandle Yahweh, causing the house to be compromised. And because of this, they're sold into bondage to Esau as a consequence. And yet we find that when the house was willing to shut the door, when the house was finally willing to change these garments, to deal with their fleshly man, to remove the idols, to shut the door, to cease the access to the enemy, they can finally now be Israel. They can finally be the one that would stand upright, the one that would prevail and have power. It's interesting because we're told that when this happens, he's on his way to from Padan Aram. In verse 9, it specifically tells us Yahweh appeared unto Jacob again when he came out of Padan Aram. Well, at this point, we know he's already been living in Shechem. Why does it specifically tell us Padan Aram, where he used to be in the house of Laban? Let's look at this word Padan Aram, because perhaps it's another clue. It comes from the root Padan, Strong's number 6307, and it's translated as meaning field. But I think this is a very poor translation. In fact, if you look at the roots of this word, it's connected to the same root stem as the word Padah, Strong's number 6299, and it means to ransom, to redeem, to rescue, to deliver, to set free from servitude. Isn't that interesting? Because Jacob just sold the whole house into it. In Exodus 13:15, the same word is used. It says, but all the firstborn of my children I redeem. That's significant because Jacob gave back the birthright, the inheritance of the firstborn. And yet we find here that Yahweh's reminding him, that's your rightful inheritance. You're the firstborn. I'm going to redeem you. I'm going to deliver you from your servitude. I'm going to buy you back. It's a cognate of the word pidyon, which means to ransom, redemption, and it refers to money that was exchanged, the money that was paid to redeem that individual. It deals with the ransoming of the Israelite firstborn males. So we find that it's no accident that Yahweh shows up and once again renames Jacob as Israel, once again declares over him his birthright, because we find that it's a reminder to Jacob that Yahweh is going to buy him back. He's going to release Israel from their servitude and their bondage to Esau. We find that it's setting it in motion. He's buying them back from the covenant that they've cut with Esau, just as he would later go through the same process with his descendants and Pharaoh. Yahweh again redeems Israel. He buys them back from Pharaoh. He sets them free from their servitude and their bondage. But we find the clue here with Jacob. It was only when they were willing to bury the idols. It was only then when they were willing to put them away. Do you realize the same goes for the house today? When we're ready to get rid of the idols, when we're ready to declare him as king and shut the door to the enemy, then and only then can we be set free. There's a lot of things that can have authority in our lives. It's not always a graven image that we have sitting up on the mantle looking at it. It can take a lot of forms. It's anything that we put above Yahweh. It's anything that comes first. It's all about your priorities. What's first? Who do you serve the most? You can't serve two masters. You're going to love one and you're going to hate the other. In Numbers chapter 18, verse 16, in order to redeem the firstborn, we're told of the process that has to go through. It says, and those that are to be redeemed from a month old that shalt thou redeem, according to thine estimation, for the money of 5 shekels, after the shekel of the sanctuary, which is 20 gerahs. 5 shekels was the price of redemption. That's interesting because if we backtrack, remember the gift that Jacob brings to Esau, the present? Well, if you read the present and you look at it, there was 5 different groupings of animals. Once again, there's that number 5. When Israel later comes out of bondage in Egypt from Pharaoh, we find that we're told that they come out in ranks of 5. Once again, this number 5. They leave harnessed, is what you're told in the King James English, in Exodus 13:18. But in the Hebrew, it's the word meaning arrayed in 5. They come out in a rank of 5. It's interesting because that letter 5 is connected to the Hebrew letter Hey. It means to reveal, to behold, to call your attention to something. Could it be then that when Jacob sends this present to Esau, but he does it in the groups of 5, the 5 different groups of animals, it's as if he's waving, hey, remember me? He's calling Yahweh's attention to the fact, my house is about to be sold into bondage. We opened the door a ways back, and now we're kind of at the end of this, and the covenant's being sealed, and he's calling upon the only one that he knows that can redeem him. Jacob can't get out of this on his own. The covenant's been signed, it's been sealed, but he knows that there's one that can redeem him. He knows there's one that can buy him back and set him free. It's the same thing with Adam and Eve in the garden. In the midst of being cursed, in the midst of suffering from the consequences, Adam interrupts Yahweh. Don't forget, her name's Eve, Havah. She's the mother of all living. Remember, there's going to be one that's going to redeem us, that's going to come through her, the Messiah. So we find then that it's calling Yahweh's attention to the fact that Jacob's house is now in need of redemption. It's setting into motion the redemption process. How many of you realize it do you some good too to put Yahweh in remembrance and let him know you're ready? You'd like to be redeemed. You know, the slavery, it's been okay. We've been here for a while. But, you know, I really think I'm ready now. I really think I'm willing to close the doors and do whatever it takes to get out of it, to be redeemed and not have to go through this same cycle again. It's interesting because not only does he send these animals in groups of 5, but if you count the total number that he sends to Esau, it equals 550. 550 is the numerical value of the Hebrew word nesher, and it means eagle. In Exodus 19:4, he talks about the redemption from Egypt. You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. In the book of Revelation, once again, it talks about the eagle's wings carrying, redeeming again, being redeemed, being brought out of the bondage. And it's talking about this generation. It's talking about those in the end, that when you'd be redeemed, when you'd be bought back, once again, eagle's wings. Isn't it amazing how in the midst of being sold into bondage, the redemption plan of Yahweh was already in motion? Even as he sends and allows the very judgment upon them, he's already reminding them, by the way, you can get out of this. It doesn't have to be permanent. You don't have to stay in that bondage. You can be set free. You can be delivered from it. But the clue, the thing that will spur it on, the thing that will set your redemption into motion is when you choose to make teshuvah, when you choose to return, to repent, to close the doors that you opened, then and only then can you be redeemed. It's interesting because, as we said earlier, the only difference between the two namings of Jacob, the first time and this time, every word is the same. The whole sentence structure is the same in the Hebrew, except for the word called. Earlier, when he is called Israel, when he encounters and wrestles with the messenger, the term that's used there is Amar. You'll be called Israel now. Amar, Strong's number 559, and it means to say, to speak, to utter. But here, when it says that he'll be called Israel, it's a different word that's used in the Hebrew. It's Strong's number 7121, kara. This word means to call out, to recite, to proclaim, but it's dealing with a public proclamation. It deals with calling a public assembly. You're being kara, you're being called together. When you begin to study the tabernacle, you'll see it's often used. A public assembly was kara, was called together to come to the tabernacle. So when we see these two different words, it seems to be hinting that this second renaming, this was a prophetical renaming. This wasn't dealing with the Jacob there. He sold his house into bondage, into slavery, but it was dealing with the descendants. It was dealing with those of Jacob's house that later would once again be in bondage, the future Israel, the outcasts of Israel that had been scattered to the four corners of the earth, that once again they would be kara, they would be called, a public assembly would be joined, they would be gathered from the four corners of the earth, having been in bondage, having been in servitude to the serpent, having been under the foot of Esau, but now the time for their redemption was at hand. But it would only come when the house in this day, when this house of Jacob, when you and I would choose to shut those doors, when you and I would choose, let's bury the idols. Let's choose to shoulder the responsibility of the Torah. Let's choose to acknowledge Yahweh as our God and as our King and serve him. Let's change our garments. Let's remove this covering. Let's allow it to be burnt up. It's interesting because the difference between these two words, kara and amar, kara has a value of 301, and amar has a value of 241. If you subtract one from the other, it equals 60. 60 just so happens to be the value of the word in Hebrew, genabah, which means a theft, something that's stolen. It's from the root ganab, which means to steal, to carry away, and it's the same word used to describe how Rachel stole the house idols, how Rachel stole the images from her father Laban. Once again, pointing to the difference between that Jacob Israel and this Jacob and Israel would be the fact that those idols would be buried. They wouldn't be in the house anymore. The doors would be shut. In order to truly be Israel, and you know what Israel means? It literally means the one who stands upright, the one who is Yashar, the one who would prevail and rule, that those would be the individuals that would be able to do that when they were willing to remove the idols from the house, to close the doors. You realize that if we're going to return home, because this is your shadow picture, Jacob's going home. If you're going to return home, it's going to require you to deal with Esau. Once again, there's going to be an encounter. Esau's been in charge of your inheritance, and we haven't had a problem with it till now. And we find that he's not going to be one just to give it back. There's going to be a battle that's going to ensue, but this time those prophecies that were proclaimed over Jacob are going to be made manifest. Esau's the one that's going to bow, because this go around, there's not going to be any open doors in the house. Can you say amen? Let's close the doors so that we can take back our inheritance. We hope that you have enjoyed this teaching, and hopefully you look at it a little different.
That was a powerful message there. You